Uncertainty at the US-Mexico border as new rules take effect. With the expiration of the COVID-era Title 42, the Biden administration implements a sweeping policy shift. While thousands attempt to enter the United States, advocates take legal action against the new regulations. But what policy would best serve U.S. interests and human rights? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's Newsmaker is the end of Title 42. The U.S. has sent 2,400 people back to Mexico since Title 42 ended late last week. Thousands of others have also been repatriated to countries including Colombia, Honduras, and Peru. But despite the deportations, U.S. states are still struggling to cope with the influx of migrants. Just before the pandemic health emergency law ended, a record 10,000 people were crossing into the U.S. every day. Last week, Chicago declared a state of emergency in order to access funding to house the migrants sent there. But surprisingly, the massive uptick at the border expected in the wake of Title 42 ending just hasn't happened. Here's a look at why.
Uncertainty hangs over the US-Mexico border after Title 42 expired last week. The pandemic-era restriction had allowed the US to swiftly deport migrants without hearing their cases for asylum. Authorities have conducted 2.7 million expulsions in 3 years. Migrants flocked to the border ahead of the deadline, and with more than 10,000 crossings each day, asylum officers struggled to cope. But the US Homeland Security says the numbers have since dropped by half, and that has a lot to do with the restrictions that have replaced Title 42.
We provide lawful, safe, and orderly pathways for people to come to the United States when they qualify for relief. We have a security and a humanitarian obligation to cut the smugglers out. For those individuals, those people who do not use our lawful pathways, we have tougher consequences to deliver to them if they arrive at our southern border and cross illegally.
While Title 42 allowed for quick expulsions, the migrants faced no legal consequences, so they could cross the border multiple times. But now, deported migrants would be barred from entry for 5 years, and if they do, they could face criminal prosecution. The US will also remove migrants who enter via a third country unless they have been denied protection there. One exemption is made for those who manage to get an appointment through the Border Patrol app, CBP-1. The app is meant to create an efficient and secure asylum system, yet only around 1,000 daily appointments are available, while hundreds of thousands are seeking entry. What's more, many migrants do not have smartphones, let alone access to Wi-Fi.
It opens specifically at 1 hour. If in that minute or two you can't make the appointment, we have to wait another day. The next day once at the same time.
2 or 3 days ago, a guy from Haiti arrived in Tijuana. His wife crossed by and he was returned, even if having an appointment. He doesn't know the reason or anything. He doesn't know why they returned it.
There was a lot of uncertainty, a lot of stress, a lot of depression.
Undoing Donald Trump's immigration policies was one of President Joe Biden's key election pledges. Although he reversed some of those, he kept Title 42. But now he is replacing it with even tougher restrictions. Human rights groups have condemned the plan, calling it an asylum ban, and they have already taken legal action to block it.
Last night, we filed a new challenge against the Biden administration's devastating asylum ban that will prevent many people from being able to seek safety in the United States. The ban mimics 2 harmful and illegal Trump-era asylum policies that Biden promised to end.
Migrants waiting at the US border are desperate for a better life and to escape political instability, violence, and poverty back home. And while the lawsuit may end Biden's new restrictions, it'll have no power over the conditions forcing people to flee.
So, are migrants facing the wrath of more broken immigration policy at the US-Mexico border, or can it be fixed? Joining me now to debate that and more are from Charlotte, North Carolina, Andrew Arthur. He's a resident fellow in law and policy for the Center for Immigration Studies. Vicki Gaubeca joins us from Tucson, Arizona. She's an associate director of U.S. Immigration and Border Policy for the U.S. program at Human Rights Watch. And in Washington is Alexandra Williams, a senior attorney at Murray Osorio. Thanks all so much for being with us. Alexandra, I'll start with you. What is your biggest problem with what's happening right now on the border with this change in policy?
My biggest problem is that this is not what the Biden administration promised that they would do. Coming off of the Trump administration and all the difficulties we had with what we call the asylum ban, the regulations that were challenged and overturned, now to implement a new, what I would call a draconian regulation right after the lifting of Title 42, I think is inhumane. And it's not what we were promised.
Inhumane, and what is illegal about it, in your opinion?
In my opinion, it's contrary to international human rights law. The Geneva Conventions, the protocols don't say that you're supposed to apply for asylum in the countries that you're coming through. It says you are allowed to apply for asylum, and it's legally. It's not an unlawful thing to do to come to a country and apply for asylum. So the fact that people are being turned away if they're not applying through an application, where people wouldn't even have access to the internet, or if they are not knowledgeable of how to do that, is inhumane.
Okay.
And illegal.
Yeah. Andrew, do you take the same issues?
No, actually, I don't. The biggest issue that I've had with the Biden administration is it's just not following the law that Congress has written. Congress has said all of those migrants who enter illegally are supposed to be detained from the point at which they're encountered until the point at which they're either removed or granted asylum. And a number of recent court cases have actually found exactly the same thing. The Biden administration is breeding uncertainty at the border, which is part of the reason why we have a problem. With respect to President Biden's promises, I'll note that I served presidents between George H.W. Bush and Barack Obama. They all followed the law. This administration isn't.
Okay. Let me get Vicki's opinion then. I imagine you're more towards Alexandra's view, but as far as the migrants are concerned, and those legitimately seeking to claim asylum, I mean, things really have gone from bad to a lot worse at this point, have they not?
Yes, absolutely. And I concur with Alexandra's opinion. I think that it not only violates our international human rights obligations, this new ruling that the Biden administration has issued, and in fact, it violates even our own domestic policies on asylum. Regardless of how a person enters a country, there's always a due process right to seek protection by expressing credible fear to return. And they're just flat out denying that possibility that day in court for people who either do not apply previously and have been denied asylum elsewhere, or they have crossed the border in a regular fashion. And this is a contravention of what we've been doing for years before the Trump administration. And it unfortunately will result in people entering the United States in a more irregular fashion. So we're going to see people entering irregularly through more remote parts of the border region, which means that we're going to see a higher number of migrant deaths. And this is a very unfortunate position from the Biden's perspective.
Okay, Andrew, I need to come back to Andrew then and ask you what is or was the winning formula here, the winning policy that lawmakers are missing? How could this be well managed if you've seen it well managed in the past?
Well, and I go back to the Obama administration. President Obama had a fundamental policy, and that was of deterrence. They would apprehend and detain migrants who would enter illegally. They would send messages throughout Central America warning of the dangers. In fact, Joe Biden went to Guatemala City in June of 2014 and advised parents not to send their children to the United States because of the high likelihood that they'd be assaulted both physically and sexually on the trip here. The Biden administration has completely abandoned all of those deterrence tools in favor of a policy of creating what it calls safe, orderly, and legal pathways. They're neither safe nor legal nor orderly.
Alexandra, did the Obama policy work, in your opinion? And then, if so, why isn't it being re-implemented?
I think he makes a good point. There was a policy of deterrence. There was, like he said, and even into the Biden administration, I believe Kamala Harris also went to Guatemala telling people not to come to the border. I think that shows just how desperate these people are. There's a saying that you don't send, your children many miles unless the road behind you is more dangerous in the first place. And so I think the fact that people are doing this despite these deterrents from the past speaks volumes about what's going on and how afraid they are and how they have the right to seek asylum for the place they feel most safe.
Is it possible, though, that because of the changes in policy over the last years, those deterrents have been forgotten?
I mean, perhaps the speeches were forgotten, but the facts remain the same, that you don't send away your loved ones, you don't go yourself on a journey that you know to be dangerous unless there's something to fear where you're leaving behind.
Vicki, go ahead.
Yeah. I mean, look, let's really look at the history of the border. I've lived on the border for most of my life, different parts of the border, and straight up, the deterrence policies have existed along the U.S.-Mexico border, not since Obama, but since 1994, when the Border Patrol first came up with the idea that we needed to deter people from coming. And so they implemented all kinds of militarization techniques, like building the wall and quadrupling the number of Border Patrol agents on the U.S.-Mexico border, increasing sanctions and prosecutions of migrants that entered in an irregular fashion. Nothing of that has worked. In fact, all it's done is created more suffering. It hasn't stopped people from coming. And the reality is that it is an inhumane approach to individuals who, according to our own laws, we should allow, giving them due process to hearing their case for asylum or for any other humanitarian parole or for reunifying with family members in the United States.
Okay.
I think it's...
sorry, Vicki, I thought you'd finish there, but because I wanted to go back to something I'd heard you say before, because you've taken issue with how particularly the media has portrayed the problems on the border, saying they've greatly exaggerated the number of people crossing over. Why does that matter?
I mean, I think what it did was it created a media frenzy, right? A moment where we thought, oh, the sky is falling. And people are kind of running around saying that there was going to be this huge invasion at the border, and nothing could be further from the truth. That doesn't mean, however, that people are going to stop coming. Or what I really think right now is happening is that there's a reassessment of people on the ground, because most people want to come here lawfully. So they're trying to figure out how to do that right now. And unfortunately, what they're going to learn is that the Biden administration has actually narrowed the pathway to the United States, has made it more difficult. And unfortunately, that's going to result in terrible consequences. As I mentioned earlier, last year, there was a record number of migrant remains found in the desert. There were 850 remains. And we're unfortunately expecting the same thing to happen once people realize that it's not, that these pathways to the United States aren't as broad as the Biden administration claims they are.
Andrew, I want to come back to you because Alexandra was alluding to, the conditions these people are fleeing are so abhorrent that they're left with no choice. So whatever happened to addressing the problems in the countries that these migrants have originated from, not least El Salvador, Honduras, issues there that people can legitimately, in some senses, blame on the U.S. history there, particularly in El Salvador, and the rise of the whole gang problem that exists in that country and the violence that exists there that some say goes back to the civil war of El Salvador in the 80s that the U.S. intervened on. Why has it really seemed to have fallen off the radar, the fact that the U.S. was going to try and help these countries and the migrants in their countries of origin?
Well, and it's interesting because, my history in immigration goes back to when I started at the Department of Justice in 1992. And I can remember the situation on the ground in those Central American countries. When they were coming out of civil war, there was still a lot of problems. Those countries have actually gotten a whole lot better in the intervening years, and yet the number of migrants coming from those countries has increased. In fact, it wasn't until 2014 that the number of migrants from what we call the Northern Triangle countries of El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras entering the United States illegally exceeded the number of Mexicans. It was, as recently as 2007, that more than 90% of all migrants entering the United States illegally were single adult males from Mexico. So, this is more of a policy in the United States, more of a pull factor than a push factor issue in those home countries. The Biden administration has essentially opened the United States border, de facto, if not de jure, and people are coming. And yeah, there are a lot of deaths because the Biden administration has created an attractive nuisance that draws migrants to the border at their peril. So, we need to go back to the deterrents, but I agree with you. We need to work with those countries to improve the rule of law, to improve the economy, and to improve safety in those countries. And, the State Department is supposed to do that, and they should, and that's what we need to return to.
Alexandra, is there, interestingly said by Andrew, is there a pull factor now rather than a push factor to some extent? Would you agree that it might not be so much the conditions that they're fleeing rather than just the prospect of a much better life in the United States, whether they can get there legally or not?
I mean, certainly I think it's a factor for some people, not for all people. I think everyone has their reasons for coming. I do agree with Andrew that we could be doing a better job of working diplomatically with some of these countries and the issues on the ground, specifically in El Salvador and Honduras, with gang violence issues. And I do think that that's some of the problem, but the conditions still for a lot of people is creating this push factor, pushing them to the border, regardless of what's going to happen to them at the border. Oftentimes detention is better than being in their home country if they have to do it.
And Vicki, same question to you also. If you can talk a little bit more about what the actual human rights conditions are here on the border and what worries you most about how vulnerable people are at the border now.
I think there are still push factors, and let's not forget that many of these migrants are leaving because of an extreme climatic event that happened in their country. There's droughts, there's hurricanes. So, and we're going to, continue to see migration as a result of climate change throughout the world as a large contributing factor to the reason why they're moving. So I think that we need to look at that. And then seriously, we really need to look at what's happening on the border. There is a different way of doing things. And I am saddened by the fact that the Biden administration lacks the vision and the courage to create a totally different system at the U.S.-Mexico border where we could create these humane reception centers for a fraction of the cost of all of the militarization on the U.S.-Mexico border. We have spent billions and billions and billions of taxpayer dollars at the U.S.-Mexico border. And again, that is only causing more problems, more human rights violations. And pushing people back into Mexico is not the solution because Mexico also has a lot of problems, particularly in the northern border towns, and that's resulting in a lot of human rights violations of migrants who are stuck there. So we need a completely different approach. Okay. And I think that the U.S. has the resources to do that.
Yeah, arguably so. But Andrew, I'll come back to you because one of the problems, and when we talk about media coverage, as Vicki was saying earlier, a lot of it is pretty exaggerated. And as you know, a lot of it turns out to be some scaremongering on behalf of especially certain right-wing media outlets saying that, these, and even Donald Trump's rhetoric, saying that these are all criminals invading our country. So do we actually have a better idea of what proportion of those tens of thousands trying to enter do legitimately merit asylum, and then what proportion might have a criminal background that would need to be investigated and they need to be kept out?
Yeah, and honestly, that's one of the biggest problems that we have at the southwest border today. And I agree with you. We don't need, inflammatory rhetoric on, either side. There really should only be one side of this issue. But yeah, unfortunately, we don't. And in fact, in a recent federal court decision, the judge noted the fact that the Border Patrol was releasing people about whom it really knew very little. Part of the reason why Congress has said that all those migrants are supposed to be detained is so that we can, run the checks, make sure who they are, verify that they have asylum claims, and only release them from custody once they've been granted asylum. I was a judge, I was an immigration judge at a detained immigration court. It was very humane, it was very safe. All of the needs of the folks in the facility were taken care of at government expense. It wasn't foisted upon New York or Chicago or Washington or Philadelphia to take care of those people. That's what we need to return to. But the Biden administration is actually asking Congress to cut its detention funding in its FY 2024 budget at a time that we're seeing one of the largest migrant surges. In fact, last year was the largest migrant surge we've ever seen in our history. So if we go back to what Congress said, and we do what Congress says we should do, this problem will resolve itself. But unfortunately, the Biden administration has shown itself reluctant, if not loath, to enforce the laws that Congress has written.
Yeah, Alexandra, again, I mean, is that too simple to say, let's just go back to the former policy? Because others might argue the numbers are just too big at this point. The backlog is just too big. It's just too much strain on the system.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think detaining every individual that comes until they're released, until they pass their asylum claim is realistic, nor is it upholding due process. First of all, once you're detained, it's very hard to get access to counsel. I laughed a little bit when Andrew was speaking, only because I do practice in the immigration court where he was a judge. I've never been before him before, and I think that was before my time, so I can't speak to the conditions at that time. But I do know at this time, the detention center that's overseen by that court, or the remnants of that court, is not a humane center. Bad things happen in that detention center all the time, and I think that just increases the chance of violence and lack of due process. And so that's definitely not the solution. I believe in some of the protocols and implementations, handbooks regarding the Geneva Convention and the refugee protocols talked about open air areas. Whether or not that's going to be something that's doable at the border, I'm not sure, but certainly not detention.
Vicki, you seem to nod your head in agreement with what Alexandra was saying about the conditions at that detention center, and that's not the answer either?
No, it's not. I mean, I think that we have over-relied, the United States government has over-relied on a punitive and carceral model for just about everything. And I think that it won't resolve itself if we return to any prevention deterrence. That's all we've done for the last 3 decades. It's like the definition of insanity. And not only that, but it's the core of the cruelty of our policies, because detaining someone without any access to counsel or in conditions that are not very good. I mean, what is the point of that? These are individuals who are only seeking, to reunite with their family here, or even if they're just seeking a better life. There is no real, reason why we should be locking up people who are only seeking a better life or who are actually seeking protection. I mean, these people have gone through an incredible journey to get here. It's not an easy journey to make. And what do we do when they get here? We throw them into a jail. That's preposterous that our country does that.
Andrew, your final thoughts?
Yeah, no, I would disagree with much of what's been said. I agree with a lot of it. But unless we have deterrence, people are going to undertake that journey. And, I heard before that, the road behind them is worse than the road ahead. Well, they're drawn to this country by the lives of smugglers. I mean, that is one thing I agree with the Biden administration on. If they know that once they get to the United States, that they're going to be free to live and work here for decades, if not forever, they're going to come and they're going to, put their lives at risk. Doctors Without Borders indicated that more than 2/3 of all migrants are physically assaulted on the way to the United States. Almost 1/3 of all women are sexually assaulted on the way to this country. We need to stop that. We need to come up with a new model. Perhaps we treat them all as refugees. We have refugee camps outside of the United States or safe areas where they can go to make their claims and be, sent to any refugee receiving country, including the United States. But every country in the Western Hemisphere, aside from Guyana and Cuba, is a signatory to either the 1951 Refugee Convention or the 1967 Protocol. And it's time that we leverage our partners in the hemisphere to help deal with this problem.
Andrew Arthur, that will have to be the final word. I'd like to thank all three of my panelists really so much for being with us on this edition of The Newsmakers, and our viewers, of course, for tuning in as well. Remember, you can follow us on Twitter, and do be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.